Seoul, December. The kind of cold that makes the city glitter instead of freeze. Seo-jun moves through it the way he moves through everything, controlled, silent, untouchable. Men twice his age lower their eyes when he passes. He built that reaction on purpose, brick by brick, ever since the night he buried the only woman he ever let close. Across town, Sarah steps off a flight from Nigeria with her brother Minho's name on her lips and no idea what world she's walking into. She isn't looking for danger. She isn't looking for him. But at a Christmas charity gala full of men who flinch at Seo-jun's name, Sarah does something none of them dare. She talks to him like he's ordinary. He doesn't correct her. That's the first mistake. It won't be his last. Subscribe if you want to see the exact moment his walls start cracking, and drop a comment telling me which city you're watching this from. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story's traveled to reach you. Seo-jun had learned, a long time ago, that silence was the most expensive thing a man could own. Everyone around him could be bought: loyalty, muscle, information, even fear. But silence, the kind that made grown men lower their eyes and clear their throats before they dared speak to him, that had to be built. He had built his brick by brick, year by year, until it stood taller than the glass towers his organization owned across Gangnam. He was 28 years old, and already a legend whispered about in rooms he'd never entered. Seoul's underworld called him many things: the Winter King, the ghost of Itaewon, the boy who inherited an empire and turned it into a fortress. But no one called him weak, and no one called him soft. Not since the night 5 years ago that had carved him into whoever he was now. Her name had been Yoon-hee. He didn't let himself say it often, not even in his own head, because saying it summoned everything else with it. Her laugh in the passenger seat of his first car, the ring he'd already chosen before she died, the black sedan that ran her off Banpo Bridge on a rain-soaked November night that the police had filed as an accident, and that Seo-jun had spent 5 years proving was not. He never found all the answers. He found enough to know that someone close to him had made the call. Someone who still, perhaps, sat at his table and called him boss. So he stopped searching for love and started searching for control instead. Control didn't leave you. Control didn't bleed out on wet asphalt while you screamed a name into the rain. He rebuilt his father's organization into something colder and far more precise, and he wore his grief like a well-tailored coat, visible only in the cut of his silence, never in his face. By the time December wrapped Seoul in lights and everyone else's laughter, Seo-jun had become something the city both feared and needed. Men brought him problems the police couldn't solve. Corporations paid him to make competitors disappear from contracts, not from the earth, that line, at least, he still respected. He funded half the charity galas that photographed well in the newspapers, because a king needed a kind face for the cameras, even if the warmth never reached past his cufflinks. He told himself he had made peace with the life he'd chosen. He told himself a great many things, in the quiet hours before dawn, that were not entirely true. Across the world in Lagos, Sarah had spent that same December folding the last of her belongings into 2 suitcases and trying to explain to her mother, for the 3rd time, why she needed to leave. Seoul, her mother had said, testing the word like it might dissolve on her tongue. Sarah, cold country, snow, no jollof. I'll survive, Mummy. Minho is there. He has an apartment. He has a whole life there already. Her mother had only sighed the particular sigh of a woman who knew her daughter had already decided, and no amount of maternal worrying was going to change a single suitcase's worth of that decision. Sarah had always been like this, warm enough to light a room, stubborn enough to walk straight into whatever she wanted from it. She'd finished her degree, spent 2 years exhausted and unfulfilled at a bank job in Lagos, and when her brother called and said, half joking, half hopping, "Just come now. See the city, see if you like it," she had said yes before he finished the sentence. The flight was long. Seoul, when she stepped out of the airport into it, was longer still, taller, colder, stranger than anything she'd braced herself for, all glass and neon, and a cold that bit through her coat in a way Lagos heat never had to defend against. But Minho was waiting at arrivals with a sign that said, in badly drawn bubble letters, "Welcome home, Sarah," and she'd laughed so hard she nearly dropped her carry-on. "You've gotten softer," she told him, hugging him tight. Seoul agrees with you. Seoul agrees with everyone who has good coffee and good money, Minho said, taking her bags. Come, you're going to love Christmas here, trust me. He wasn't wrong. Within a week, Sarah had fallen into the rhythm of the city the way she fell into most things, completely, without hesitation. She loved the fairy lights strung across Myeongdong like the whole street had been dipped in stars. She loved the roasted chestnut carts and the church bells that rang over department stores blasting carols in 2 languages. She dragged Minho to a Christmas market and made him try tteokbokki with her, laughing at his forced enthusiasm, and she called their mother every night to describe it all in the kind of detail that made the older woman finally admit, grudgingly, that it sounded beautiful. You're glowing, Minho told her one evening, over dinner in his small, warm apartment. Seoul already loves you. Seoul hasn't met me yet, Sarah said, grinning. Give it time. What she didn't know, what Minho had spent years being very careful never to tell her, was that Seoul had already shaped the rest of his life around a man Sarah had never heard of. Minho's loyalty to Seo-jun ran deeper than employment, deeper than friendship even, rooted in a debt from a night years ago that Minho didn't talk about, not even to his sister. Especially not to his sister. He had built 2 entirely separate lives, one soft, one sharp, and he'd never once let them touch. Until the charity gala. It was Minho's company, technically, that sponsored a table at the annual Christmas charity event downtown. One of the events Seo-jun's foundation quietly funded, and just as quietly required his appearance at, camera-ready and unreadable. Minho hadn't planned on bringing Sarah, but she'd found the flyer on his kitchen counter, all fairy lights and calligraphy, and her eyes had lit up in that particular way he knew better than to argue with. Community outreach, gift drives, a whole Christmas market for charity, she'd read aloud. Minho, I'm coming. It's mostly business people being photographed for looking generous, he warned her. Then I'll be the one person there actually having fun, she said, and that, more than anything, was exactly the kind of answer that terrified him, because he knew precisely who else would be in that room. The gala was held in the ballroom of one of the city's most expensive hotels, transformed for the evening into something between a winter forest and a museum, white branches strung with warm light. A string quartet playing carols slowed down into something aching and beautiful, waitstaff in black moving through crowds of Seoul's wealthiest with trays of champagne and canapes shaped like snowflakes. Sarah, in a deep red coat that made her impossible to lose in a crowd, wasn't interested in champagne. She found the volunteer table almost immediately, the actual charity work happening in a side room, where gifts were being wrapped and sorted for children's shelters across the city, and she rolled up her sleeves before Minho had even finished his second drink. You're supposed to be a guest, he told her, trailing after her. I'm supposed to be useful, she corrected, already tying ribbon around a box shaped like a small drum. Go network or whatever it is you do at these things. I'll be here. Seo-jun had arrived exactly on schedule, exactly as expected, black overcoat, unreadable expression. The kind of entrance that made a room lower its volume without anyone announcing it. He shook the hands he was required to shake, smiled the smile that photographed well and meant nothing, and slipped away from the main floor at the earliest acceptable moment, the way he always did, toward somewhere quieter. He didn't go to the side room to volunteer. He went there because it was, reliably, the one part of these events with no cameras and no men trying to get 5 minutes of his time to pitch some deal he had no interest in. He could stand near the gift-wrapping tables for 10 minutes, breathe, and reappear composed. He didn't expect to find someone already there who didn't know who he was. Oh, perfect, another set of hands, Sarah said, not even looking up fully, already sliding a roll of ribbon and a stack of boxes toward him. These are for the shelter on Yeonhyeodong. We're behind. Can you tie a bow or are you a folder? Seo-jun stood very still for a moment, the way he did when something happened that his brain hadn't pre-calculated, which was rare, and which always unsettled him more than he let show. He started. Folder then, Sarah decided, already handing him a flattened box. That's fine. Everyone starts somewhere. He should have said something. He should have let the silence do what it always did, remind whoever was in front of him exactly who they were speaking to. Instead, absurdly, he picked up the box and began folding it because it was easier, in that moment, than explaining who he was to someone who so clearly didn't care. "I'm Sarah," she said, glancing up now, offering a smile with no calculation in it at all, no flattery, no fear, no attempt to read what he could do for her. Just warmth, offered plainly, the way you'd offer it to anyone standing beside you doing the same small, unglamorous work. "You're not from the events team, are you? You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." "Is it that obvious? You're holding that ribbon like it might bite you." Something moved in his chest that he didn't have a name for anymore. It had been so long since anyone spoke to him without first calculating the cost of the words. He almost smiled. Almost. "I don't usually do this part," he admitted, which was, in its own way, the most honest sentence he'd spoken at one of these events in years. "Well, you're doing it now, so." She slid another box toward him. "Yon Hui Dong, fold faster. The children don't care how good you look doing it, they care about the drum." He laughed, a short, surprised sound, rusted from disuse. And for the length of that laugh, he was not the Winter King, not the ghost of Idiwan, not a man who had buried a woman and buried himself alongside her. He was only a man folding a box beside a woman who had no idea what she'd just done. They worked in comfortable near silence after that, broken by Sarah's easy, unbothered chatter. About the city, about the cold, about Minho's terrible taste in coffee, about Lagos and the heat she already missed, and the family she'd left behind and hadn't stopped thinking about. She didn't ask his name again, not directly, and he didn't offer it, and there was something dangerously comfortable in that, in being, for once, simply a man in a room instead of an institution. When Minho found them 20 minutes later, he stopped so abruptly in the doorway that a passing waiter nearly collided with him. His sister was laughing, ribbon in hand, beside Seo Jun, beside the most feared man in Seoul's underworld, who was, impossibly, folding a cardboard box with something that looked, from this angle, almost like ease. "Sarah," Minho said carefully, "I need you for a second." "We're behind on boxes," she said without looking up. "Now, Sarah." Something in his voice made her finally glance at him properly, and whatever she saw in her brother's face, the tight jaw, the flicker of alarm he wasn't quick enough to hide, made her set down the ribbon. "I'll be right back," she told Seo Jun, entirely unaware that she was the only person in that ballroom who had ever said something so casual to him and meant it as nothing more than exactly what it sounded like. In the hallway outside, Minho gripped his sister's arm, lower his voice to barely above a whisper. "Do you know who that is?" "The guy folding boxes badly. No, should I?" "Sarah," Minho exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "That's Seo Jun." The name meant nothing to her, and that, more than anything, told Minho exactly how far apart the two lives he'd built truly were. "Okay," she said slowly, and he didn't tell her everything. He couldn't, not there, not that night. Some doors, once opened, didn't close again. He told her only the smallest, safest fraction of the truth, that Seo Jun was powerful, important, someone people in Seoul did not speak to so casually, someone she should be careful around. Sarah studied her brother for a long moment, then glanced back toward the ballroom, where Seo Jun still stood by the gift table, looking, for the first time all evening, like a man who didn't quite know what to do with his own hands now that hers weren't beside them. "He didn't seem dangerous," she said. "He seemed lonely." Minho didn't have an answer for that, because he'd known Seo Jun for 8 years, and in all that time, he had never once heard anyone describe him that way, and he had never once been able to argue that it wasn't true. That single night should have ended there. It didn't. Seoul's charity season stretched the whole month, one glittering event bleeding into the next, and Sarah, through Minho's company, through her own restless need to be useful, through sheer coincidence dressed as fate, kept finding herself in rooms Seo Jun was also required to occupy. A toy drive downtown. A soup kitchen serving the elderly on the coldest night of the month. A tree lighting ceremony where Sarah, without knowing what she was doing, ended up standing beside him again while carolers sang 2 streets over. Each time, she treated him exactly the same, direct, warm, entirely unimpressed by whatever reputation trailed him into the room. Each time, something in him loosened by another fraction. A stone worked slowly loose from a wall he'd spent 5 years reinforcing. He started, against every instinct he had, arranging his schedule around these events instead of enduring them. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself a great many things. It was Sarah who suggested, 3 weeks before Christmas, that the toy drive needed more hands for a weekend build, assembling bicycles and dollhouses for a shelter's Christmas morning, an unglamorous, sawdust-and-Allen wrench kind of task that no photographer would bother attending. She hadn't expected him to show up. She hadn't, in fact, expected to see him again outside the scheduled galas at all. He came anyway, in a plain black sweater instead of a tailored coat, and spent 4 hours on the floor of a community center, assembling a bicycle with instructions he refused to admit he couldn't read, while Sarah laughed at him and eventually took the manual out of his hands entirely. "You're a terrible engineer," she informed him, tightening a bolt he'd left loose. "I run," he started, then stopped himself, the old instinct to list his empire, his holdings, his reach, catching in his throat because none of it mattered here. None of it would impress her, and for the first time in years he didn't want it to. "I run out of patience for small parts," he finished instead. "Sure you do." She grinned up at him, grease on her knuckles, hair escaping its braid, entirely unaware of how rare it was for anyone to see him like this, unpolished, corrected human. "Pass me the wrench, big man." He passed her the wrench. Later, walking her and Minho toward the subway through streets strung with lights, Seo-jun found himself doing something he hadn't done in 5 years. Talking. Not the practiced, careful sentences of business, but small things, a favorite noodle stall from his university years, a complaint about Seoul winters, an admission, offered lightly, that he'd never actually learned to skate despite the rink 2 blocks from his childhood home. "I'll teach you," Sarah said immediately. "I don't fall," he said. "Everyone falls," she said. "It's what you do after that matters." He didn't sleep well that night. Not because of nightmares, for once, but because her sentence kept circling in his head, refusing to settle, refusing to be filed away with all the other things he'd trained himself to forget. Minho noticed. Of course he noticed. It was his job to notice everything about the man he answered to, and this was the largest, strangest shift he'd seen in Seo-jun in 8 years of service. He found him 2 nights later in the penthouse office, alone, staring at the city rather than the reports on his desk, and Minho did something he rarely allowed himself. He spoke without being asked. "You need to stop," he said quietly. Seo-jun didn't turn. "Stop what?" "You know what?" Minho stepped further into the room, voice low, careful, but unwilling to back down. "She's my sister. She doesn't know what you are, what we are, what this world does to people who get close to you." "Nothing has happened." "Something is happening," Minho said. "I've known you 8 years. I've never seen you like this. Not once. Not even," he stopped himself. But the unfinished sentence hung there anyway, both of them hearing the name neither said aloud. Seo-jun's jaw tightened. "Careful." "I'm not trying to hurt you," Minho said, softer now. "You're the closest thing to a brother I have, but she is the only family I have left, and I will not watch her become a target because you can't remember how to keep a door closed." The silence that followed was long enough to feel dangerous. Then Seo-jun exhaled, and something in his shoulders dropped a fraction, not surrender exactly, but the closest thing to honesty he'd offered anyone in years. "I know what I am," he said quietly. "I know what this life does. I have spent 5 years making sure no one gets close enough to be used against me." He finally turned from the window. "I didn't ask for this." "I know," Minho held his gaze, "but wanting something doesn't make it safe. You of all people know that." Neither man said Yoonhee's name. Neither man needed to. It should have ended the conversation there, should have been enough to make Seo-jun close the door quietly and permanently, the way he'd closed every door for 5 years running. Instead, that same week, Whispers began moving through circles that had nothing to do with charity galas, rival organizations, old enemies who'd been waiting patiently for the Winter King to show even the smallest crack in his armor. A photograph, taken at the tree-lighting ceremony without either of them noticing, began circulating quietly among people who understood exactly what it meant when Seo Jun smiled at someone the way he was smiling in that frame. It reached a man named Director Choi First, an old rival of Seo Jun's late father, patient, calculating, the kind of man who had waited a decade for exactly this sort of opening. He studied the photograph for a long time, the unguarded look on the young king's face, the woman beside him utterly unaware of what she'd already become. "Find out who she is," he said finally, sliding the photograph across his desk. "Everyone has a weakness. It seems our king has finally shown us his." Miles away, unaware that her face had just been passed across a table she would never see, in a city she was only beginning to love, Sarah walked home from the market with her arms full of roasted chestnuts and her heart, for reasons she couldn't quite name, a little fuller than it had been in years. Somewhere behind her, in a penthouse office overlooking the same glittering skyline, a king who had sworn never to love again stood at his window, watching the snow fall over a city that no longer felt entirely cold, and wondered, for the first time in 5 long years, whether the wall he'd built might not be strong enough to hold. The snow that December had a way of making Seoul feel gentler than it was, softening the edges of glass towers and neon signs until the whole city looked like something out of a storybook. Sarah had started to believe in that softness. She'd started, without quite admitting it to herself, to believe in him. It was a small thing that cracked it open, the way small things always are. She'd borrowed Minho's car to drop off a box of decorations for the shelter, and in the glove compartment, tucked beneath an old parking permit, she found a folded newspaper clipping so worn at the creases it had nearly split into 4 pieces. A photograph of a young woman, smiling, dated 5 years back. A headline about an accident on Banpo Bridge. And beneath it, in her brother's handwriting, a single line that made no sense to her, and yet somehow made too much sense at once. SJ still doesn't know it was Choi's man behind the wheel. She sat in the car a long time with the heater running and the clipping in her lap, cold in a way the engine couldn't fix. She didn't confront Minho immediately. She wasn't built that way. She liked to understand things fully before she spoke, and some instinct told her this was not a thing to be careless with. So she watched, quietly, the way she hadn't let herself watch before. She noticed the men who trailed a respectful few steps behind Seo Jun at the last charity dinner, not staff, not friends, but something else entirely. She noticed how a restaurant owner's hands had trembled pouring his tea. She noticed the particular, practiced blankness that settled over his face whenever a stranger approached him too quickly, like a door slamming shut before anyone could see what was behind it. She noticed, and she said nothing, and the not saying sat heavier in her chest with every passing day. It was Seo Jun, in the end, who broke first. They were walking along the frozen edge of the Han River after a late volunteer shift, breath fogging between them, and he caught her looking at him with something new in her expression, not fear, never fear, but a kind of careful, searching quality that hadn't been there before. "You know," he said, not a question. Sarah didn't pretend otherwise. "I know some of it," she said. "I found a clipping in Minho's car, about a woman about a bridge." She watched his jaw tighten, watched the wall go up behind his eyes and pressed on anyway, gently. "I know you're not just a businessman, Seo Jun. I've known for a while. I didn't want to believe the rest of it, but I'm not stupid, and I'm not going to insult either of us by pretending." He didn't answer for a long moment. The river moved sluggishly beneath its skin of ice, and somewhere behind them the city hummed its indifferent, glittering hum. "Her name was Yoon-hee," he said finally, quietly, and it was the first time he had said the name aloud to anyone in 5 years. "I was going to marry her. Someone in my own organization made sure that didn't happen, and I have spent 5 years trying to find out who. And every year the trail goes a little colder, and every year I become a little more like the man everyone already thinks I am." He looked at her then, and there was something raw in his face that had nothing to do with the cold. "I am not a good man, Sarah. I have done things I will never be able to explain to you in a way that makes them forgivable. I did not want you anywhere near this life. I still don't. You don't get to decide that for me, Sarah said, steady despite the tremor in her voice. I've made my own choices my whole life. Let me make this one. He wanted, more than he had wanted anything in 5 years, to believe that choosing her wouldn't cost her everything. He didn't yet know how wrong that hope would prove to be. The photograph reached Director Choi's desk again that same week, this time accompanied by a name, Sarah, sister of Min-ho, currently residing at a modest apartment near Yeonhyeodong, currently, according to his sources, spending a great deal of time in the company of the Winter King himself. Choi studied the information with the patience of a man who had waited a decade for exactly this. He had murdered the girl before. He had learned, since then, that killing wasn't always necessary. Sometimes leverage was worth infinitely more than a body. Take her, he told his men. Quietly, no blood not yet. Let our friend understand exactly what it costs to want something. It happened on an ordinary evening, 3 days before Christmas. On a street corner Sarah walked almost every day without a second thought. A car slowed beside her. A hand closed over her mouth before she could scream. By the time Min-ho realized she wasn't answering her phone, 3 hours had already passed, and the only trace of her was a dropped grocery bag spilling oranges across the icy pavement. Seo-jun received the message an hour after that. A single photograph, Sarah blindfolded in a chair, and beneath it 4 words, "Choose carefully, Winter King." Something in him went very still and very cold, colder than anything he'd felt since the night of the bridge, and beneath the cold, something else roared to life that he hadn't let himself feel in 5 years, not grief this time, but a fury so absolute it left no room for the careful, calculated man he'd built himself into. He was, in that moment, no longer strategy and silence. He was only a man whose heart had just been taken from him a second time, and this time he refused to let it happen without a fight. Min-ho found him in the office, already pulling on his coat, already issuing orders to men gathering in the hallway outside. "Where?" Min-ho said, voice shaking. "Where is she?" "I don't know yet," Seo-jun said. "But I will, and when I do, I am going to burn every building Choi owns to the ground to get her back. You can't go in blind. If this is Choi, he's been planning it for years, he'll have." "I don't care what he'll have." Seo-jun turned, and Min-ho took an involuntary step back at what he saw in his friend's face. Not the calculated coldness he knew, but something closer to the man Seo-jun might have been before the bridge. If grief hadn't hollowed him out and rebuilt him into a weapon. "She is not going to become another name I fail to protect. Get me everything you have on Choi's properties. Now." It was in the scramble of that night, in the frantic gathering of intelligence and old debts called in, that the second truth finally surfaced, the one that had been hiding in plain sight for 5 years. One of Seo-jun's own lieutenants, a quiet, careful man named Han-jae who had served him faithfully since before Yoon-hee's death, made one phone call too many, to a number Min-ho didn't recognize, and something in the timing of it, the careful way Han-jae avoided the room whenever Choi's name came up, sent Min-ho digging through 5-year-old records he hadn't touched since the funeral. What he found made his blood run cold. Han-jae's account, the week before the bridge. A payment small enough to be missed from a shell company Min-ho now recognized, after years of quiet study, as belonging to Choi. "It was him," Min-ho said, finding Seo-jun in the war room an hour before dawn, voice breaking on the words. "Han-jae, he sold you out 5 years ago. He's the one who told them which car she'd be in. He's been sitting at your table every day since, and you never knew, and his voice cracked entirely. "I should have looked harder. I should have found this years ago." Seo-jun didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was terrifyingly quiet. "Bring him to me." Han-jae didn't run. Perhaps he'd always known this day would come, or perhaps he simply had nowhere left to go. He stood in the war room with the particular stillness of a man who had made his peace with consequences long before they arrived, and when Seo-jun asked him why, only that, one word, why, Han-jae's answer was almost pitiful in its smallness. "Choi paid triple what your father paid me," he said. "I didn't know they'd kill her. I swear to you I didn't know that part. I only told them which car." You knew what kind of men they were, Seo Jun said, and something in his voice made even his most hardened men in the room go quiet. You knew, and you sold her anyway, and you have sat across from me at dinner for 5 years and let me believe I failed to find her killer when the killer was pouring my tea. He didn't kill Han Jiao. He wanted to. Every instinct honed by 5 years of grief screamed for it, but some fragment of the man Sarah had been slowly excavating from beneath the ice held his hand steady. Lock him up, he said instead, voice flat with the effort of restraint. He answers to the police, not to me. I am done letting this life decide who I become. But there was no time to feel the weight of that choice, because Sarah was still out there, and every hour that passed was an hour Choi held all the leverage. It was Han Jiao himself, in the end, offered leniency in exchange for one true thing, who gave them the address. A warehouse near the old shipping docks, one of Choi's lesser-known properties, chosen specifically because no one would think to look there. Seo Jun went in himself. He told no one to stop him, and no one tried, because by then even his most loyal men understood that something in their king had shifted permanently, that whatever had been building quietly for weeks in charity ballrooms and gift-wrapping tables had become the truest thing about him, truer than the empire, truer than the silence. The warehouse was cold and half-lit, stacked with shipping containers that smelled of salt and rust. Sarah was exactly where the photograph had shown her, blindfolded, wrists bound, but very much alive, and very much herself. Seo Jun could hear her before he saw her, arguing furiously with one of Choi's men about the tightness of the ropes, entirely unbowed even in captivity. You could at least loosen this, she was saying. It's Christmas, have some decency. The absurdity of it, the sheer stubborn brightness of her even now, nearly broke something loose in his chest. The confrontation that followed was fast and brutal, Seo Jun's men breaching from two sides, Choi's forces scattered and unprepared for an attack this direct, this unguarded by strategy. Seo Jun went straight for the center of the room, straight for her, and it was there that Choi himself stepped from the shadows, a gun raised, his patient decade-long calculation finally reaching its last, desperate move. You should have stayed cold, Choi said. You were dangerous when no one could reach you. Now look at you. Now look at me, Seo Jun agreed and didn't stop moving. The shot that rang out a moment later took him in the shoulder, close enough to have found his heart if he'd hesitated even half a second longer, and he staggered but didn't fall, because Sarah was screaming his name now, blindfold torn free, wrists still bound, fighting against the men trying to hold her back, and some fury greater than pain drove him the last few steps to put himself between her and Choi's second shot. He went down finally, blood dark against the black wool of his coat, and Choi's man aimed to finish it, but Min-ho arrived in that exact instant with the reinforcements Seo Jun had refused to wait for, and the warehouse dissolved into gunfire and shouting that Sarah would only piece together later. Because in that moment, all she knew was Seo Jun on the concrete floor, his blood warm against her hands as she finally tore her wrists free and dropped beside him. Stay with me, she said, pressing both palms hard against his shoulder, voice breaking entirely now that the fight had reached her too. Do you hear me? You do not get to do this. Not now, not after everything. His eyes found hers, unfocused but present, and his hand came up weakly to cover one of hers where it pressed against the wound. I buried my heart once, he said, voice barely more than breath. You brought it back to life. I don't regret this. I don't regret any of it. You're not saying goodbye, Sarah told him fiercely, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on her face. I refuse. Do you understand me? I did not fly across the world to lose you in a warehouse 3 days before Christmas. Min-ho reached them moments later, already calling for a medic, already pressing his own hands over the wound alongside his sister's. And between the two of them and the men Seo Jun had built his empire on, they held him together long enough for help to arrive, long enough for Choi, cornered, out of leverage, out of men, to finally be taken alive by Min-ho's own hand rather than killed. Because some part of this new world Seo Jun was building, even bleeding out on a warehouse floor, deserved to end in justice, rather than another body added to a 5-year-old grave. The days that followed blurred together in hospital light and Sarah's constant, stubborn presence at his bedside, refusing every suggestion that she go home and rest. Hanjayu's confession, combined with Choi's arrest, unraveled threads that had been knotted for 5 years. Old debts, old betrayals, an entire second layer of the organization that had been quietly working against Seo-jun from within, all of it finally exposed to daylight. What remained of his empire, once the dust settled, was smaller, cleaner, and entirely his own for the first time since he'd inherited it. He woke on Christmas morning to sunlight through a hospital window and Sarah asleep in the chair beside his bed, still in yesterday's clothes, her hand still resting over his on the blanket, as though she'd fallen asleep mid-vigil and simply refused to let go even unconscious. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, voice rough. Her eyes opened immediately, and the relief that broke across her face was worth every scar the last 5 years had left on him. "You're one to talk." He was quiet for a long moment, watching her, feeling something settle in his chest that had been unsettled for half a decade. "I built an empire so nothing could ever be taken from me again," he said finally. "And I nearly lost the only thing that ever mattered because I was too afraid to admit I wanted it." "So what happens now?" she asked, quiet, careful, giving him the space to answer honestly. "Now," he said, "I stopped being a king. I don't want a throne anymore, Sarah. I want a life. I want mornings that don't start with reports on who owes me what. I want to learn to skate badly and fall in front of you and not care who sees it." He turned his hand beneath hers, lacing their fingers together properly for the first time. "I want you, not the empire, not the fear, just this. If you'll still have a man with nothing left to offer but himself." Sarah's answer was to lean down and press her forehead gently against his, careful of the bandages, careful of everything except the truth of what she felt. "I never wanted the empire," she said softly. "I wanted the man folding boxes badly at a Christmas gala, who didn't know how to tie a ribbon and didn't seem to mind me finding that funny. I've wanted him this whole time." In the months that followed, the empire Seo-jun had built out of grief came apart piece by piece, not through violence, but through deliberate, careful dismantling. Territories signed over to legitimate business, old debts forgiven, the darker corners of the organization exposed, and handed to authorities his own testimony helped convict. Minho stood beside him through all of it, the two of them finally building something honest together, instead of something that required constant silence to survive. By the following December, a year to the week since a woman from Lagos had handed a stranger a roll of ribbon and asked if he was a folder, Seo-jun stood on the frozen edge of the Han River again, no longer a king, no longer feared, only a man in an ordinary coat waiting for the woman who had taught him that love wasn't the thing that made you weak. It was the only thing, in the end, worth being brave for. Sarah arrived exactly on time, breath fogging in the cold, her laugh carrying across the ice the way it had carried across a ballroom the night everything began, and when she reached him, he didn't hesitate the way he once might have. He simply pulled her close, snow catching in her braids, and held on to the life he had chosen, finally, over the empire he had once believed was the only thing keeping him alive.